I want to move for a bit to Kursk. So the West is now catching up with my point of view. When Ukraine first invaded Kursk region, I said to myself, okay, this is humiliating for Russia. There's that. I said, two, all of those people are going to die. Or three, all of those people are going to be pushed up. It's one or the other. They're going to die or they're going to push up. Putin is not going to negotiate on this notion of Russian territory. For him, the even thought of it as outlandish. And it seems that Western media has caught up with that point of view. So the Associated Press put out this article. And good on them for doing so, because it's one of the first honest articles the Associated Press has put out. Bloodied Ukrainian troops risk losing more hard-won land in Kursk to Russia. And I've highlighted certain quotes in this, and I want to get your take on the article in general. Well, they talk about North Koreans, that's nonsense. But right here, he says, we have hit a hornet's nest. We've stirred up another hotspot, said Stefan Litzvig. This is the 95th Airborne Assault. It says Zelensky has hinted that controlling Kursk will help force Moscow to negotiate to end the war. But 5 Ukrainians and Western officials of Kiev who spoke on condition of anonymity to freely discuss sensitive military matters said that fear gambling on Kursk will weaken the whole 1,000-kilometer front while Ukraine is losing precious ground in the east. And I said to myself, no duh. Just no duh. There's one other point before I get your take on it. Gathering his men, one company commander told them, quote, we're making history. The whole world would know about this because this hasn't been done since World War II. Privately, he was less certain. Quote, it seems crazy, he said. I didn't understand why. And then when you get to this part, it says, by early November, Russia began regaining territory rapidly. Once in awe of what they accomplished, troops' opinions are now shifting as they come to terms with their losses. The company commander said half of his troops were dead or wounded. Some frontline commanders, the conditions are tough, morale is low, and troops are questioning command decisions, even the very purpose of occupying Kursk. They even point out that the orders that they're getting make no sense because they are given orders that are so far in the rears that the people have lost the territory that Ukraine is moving pieces about. And so this last part I thought was astonishing. I definitely want to get your take on this. It says, eyeing frontline losses in eastern region known as the Donbass, where Russia is closing on crucial supply hub, some soldiers are more vocal about whether Kursk was all has been worth it. Quote, all the military can think about now is that Donbass has simply been sold. This is what a platoon commander said. And he says, at what price? That part stuck with me. Because I think he's making the point that, what was this really for? And you pulled all of these people, the best people from the front lines, in order to come through this incursion that amounted to all of these people dying by the thousands. Give me your take on that article. And that last part, this idea that they sold it. I mean, is he trying to say that this was a propaganda exercise that they were willing to risk all of these lives for? That was my take on it, that this was a propaganda exercise and you took your best people from Donbass, put them in Kursk. And in doing so, we've lost the Donbass region faster than we would have lost it if you had not went in this adventure or this escapade in the Kursk region. Give me your take on that.
Well, I think to understand the situation in Kursk, one has to understand the purely informational nature of the war, as far as the Ukrainian side is concerned, anyway. And we've seen it since the start of the hostilities, is that essentially, whether it's the what they call Spider Island or whatever, Ghost of Kiev. I mean,
Snake Island, yeah.
We've seen, Snake Island, yeah.
It's like they're holding on to the snake. Oh, it's like, all of these people have died, and then you find out later.
Yes. The fantastic gains of October 2022, October 2022 in Kharkov region. This idea that the Ukrainian army is somehow accomplishing much militarily on the ground in a war, let's remind our viewer, which is essentially a 21st century version of positional warfare, trench warfare. is par for the course in the narrative for domestic audiences in the US. The idea is to try to, using the media complex, to try to justify paying billions upon billions of dollars to Ukrainian corruption system. So yes, the Kursk excursion in that respect is comparable to the Battle of the Bulge. It's not me saying that; it's McGregor, and I would tend to agree with him. It had more of a purpose of trying to extend support, promote support as the fundamental structural aspect of the war, all alongside the Donbass line was not looking good. So you cannot wage a war like this just based on ratings or based on perceived loss of support in Congress, for instance. But that's what the Ukrainian leadership, and I would say acting on instructions from their NATO sponsor, did. And so what we have now in Kursk is, as you mentioned, the best, most trained and experienced Ukrainian troops were basically taken away from where they were much needed alongside the, let's call it the conventional front line,
Yeah.
to create this kind of bubble of reality. I mean, I'm not saying that the idea was not unlike what we saw in Syria, when the initial objective were to, somehow get into the surrounding of Aleppo, if not outright take Aleppo itself. And if, in and of itself, this alone would have been fantastic. And then they were somehow sucked into this spiral of momentum. And so I'm not saying this is not what happened in Kursk, because the idea of basically seizing Kursk nuclear power plant and blackmail Moscow in the context of future negotiation. Unfortunately, they never even got to NPP Kursk. They were at some point bogged down around Sutsa village settlements. And so then the Russian, upon, in the wake of this effect of surprise, the Russian army proceeded to do what it does best, which is to create those cauldrons and methodically grind out. At the moment where we are recording this show, I think something like 50 to 75,000 people died since the beginning of the offensive. But militarily, again, it makes no sense, because how would you expect to sustain your gains, territorial gains, to the extent you cross the river and you don't get any supply lines consolidated? So that makes no sense. Sooner or later, those people were going to find themselves isolated, on the front line. And this is what happened. Now, Russia has no incentive to actually finish him off, excuse me for the pun, because, the very symbolical, the very bare core notion that NATO-sponsored Ukrainian proxies actually have invaded old Russian land, because Kursk region would be considered old Russian land, as opposed to the new regions of the Donbass and Novorossiya, is a pretty edifying argument to make during negotiation, as far as trying to get what you want, which is security for the Russian Federation. That, hey, look, you got your own proxies are on Russian land proper. We're not talking about disputed regions, depending on which perspective you adopt on the self-determination referenda held in the Donbass and Novorossiya. Here we're talking about Russia proper. So they provided Russia all the talking points it needed for the upcoming negotiations, bearing on this need to redesign. Well, I would say redesign. No need to reinvent the wheel. Essentially, the security architecture of Europe should have been implemented by Jim Baker and co. back 30 years ago, instead of pushing NATO eastward. But to make his point even more efficiently, Putin provided a draft treaty in November, December 2021,
Hmm.
which aimed at preventing everything that has happened ever since. That fell on deaf ear, unfortunately, but this is really the core issue again here. It's trying to take Russian Federation concerns into account, because what we hear right now coming from Washington, despite not withstanding Trump's campaign slogans about ending the conflict in 24 hours, he's a non-starter.
Yeah,
Sergei Lavrov gave an interview 3, 4 days ago where he covered the grounds again, and he says he repeated again that whatever we're hearing, it's a non-starter. So we're going to proceed apace until we accomplish our aims, essentially.
and
So this is where we are right now. But Kursk was another one of those informational, uh, trying to capture the mind of domestic support and trying to promote the idea that it's worthy supporting those democratic loving Ukrainians as they invade another country's territory, essentially.
yeah, basically, give me more money. Look at all of the work I'm doing.
Yeah,
We can really win
look,
this thing.
flip
Trust
it.
me. Look at we've just invaded Curse. Yeah, that didn't work all that well in practice. I often say propaganda fails to reality at some point, and we are at the point where they are losing more manpower and more territory faster than what they were prior. I'm glad you brought up Lavrov, because that was going to be one of the questions I brought up. Lavrov pointed out that, look, anything that we've heard coming out of people in the Trump camp has not necessarily been something we can agree upon, and that we are not changing our red lines, or the negotiating structure. We want the Istanbul Agreement plus, meaning plus the new lands that have been added to the Russian Federation. What I think they ultimately want, though, is what you pointed out, a new security architecture of Europe. And I guess what would that security architecture of Europe look like, using Ukraine as a platform or as a basis for that new security architecture? Meaning, what would Russia agree to? And how would they ensure that the agreement is a legitimate agreement? When the Minsk agreements came out, I know the Minsk agreements was not necessarily a security architecture of Europe, but on some level, it was, because the idea was Ukraine was going to be somewhat neutral. Those territories are going to remain under the auspices of Ukraine, even though they're going to be somewhat autonomous. Um,
Hmm.
and Angela Merkel comes out and said, "We lied about that. A deal that should have ended the conflict was used as a way for allowing Ukraine to build up a massive military on the Russian border." So, how does Russia ensure that whatever they come up with as a new security architecture for Europe proper, um, take into account Russian security interests in a way that is believable and verifiable? I'm curious in your take, because this is the ultimate question, right? Because the reality of it is, Russia's point is Ukraine is not going to be part of NATO, not now, not in 20 years, full stop. It is against our security interests. And more to the point, we need to have a way for us to verify that whatever deal that we put on paper that is legally binding, and of course, legally binding, I often say there's no such thing as international law because there's nobody to enforce international law. So in this very specific case, how does Russia ensure that whatever is pinned on paper, when an agreement is signed, whatever that agreement is, and whatever that new security architecture of Europe is, how do they ensure that it is worth the paper that it's written on? And what does it look like in practice?
Well, in order to answer this question, you need to look back in history as usual. Back in the days of the Soviet Union after World War II, it will interest your viewers that the point of from Moscow was not to install communist regime in those countries. The initial aim, and this you need to research it, but was actually to lean on a far right movement, nationalist movement. Unfortunately, they did not find people to play along, so they ended up basically installing, crypto communist, local communist movement and parties to run those countries. But my
Mhm.
point is that the idea was to create this. Russia has this notion, what's called the near abroad, right? It knows that owing to its geography, it is not impervious to military aggression from the West. This goes back to the days of Napoleon, and so it needs to create this kind of cordon sanitaire, this
Yes.
somehow assortment of states or state entities which can, push back westward as far as can possibly be done any kind of threat or potential threat from eating Russia proper. Keeping in mind that two of the most important administrative and political center of Russia are not very far from Russia's historical western borders.
Mhm.
So this has always been part of the Russian game plan as far as guaranteeing its own security interest. How would this take place in the current situation? Well, to be sure, no need to reinvent the wheel again here. We had Finland. Finland was neutral for about 75 years until
Was.
last year it joined NATO,
Right, that's what it
adding
was.
yes, adding the alliance an additional 1,500 kilometers alongside the Russian Federation's border. By the way, so that's an additional 1,500 kilometers or miles, or close
Right.
to 2,000, 1,000 mile, 1,500 kilometers of borders that the Russian armed forces are going to have to protect, essentially. So, but if we look at Ukraine, yes, Ukraine should be completely demilitarized. There should not be any kind of hypersonic installation put on it. There should not be any European peacekeeping, quote unquote, forces stationed by any way, in any stretch, possible. It should be a demilitarized zone, completely demilitarized. Although it has been conceded that if it wants to join the EU, it perfectly can do so. But to the extent, and this was repeatedly said again, people seem to not want to listen in the West. What the Russian leadership is saying is that you cannot promote your security concern at the expense of another country's, or especially a neighbor country's, security.
Right.
And so, to the extent NATO, as you said, uh, was basically, if you look at the guarantor states of the Minsk Accord, two of the most prominent NATO members, who basically planned out and said, came out and said, it was never our intent to, do just that. We played along, beat it for time, and allowed the Ukrainian proxy army to be assembled until the moment would come where we would, try to use it as a essentially a prying instrument to
Mhm.
destroy Russian sovereignty. So for the time being, Russia's lines are pretty clear: demilitarization of Ukraine, turning militarily speaking Ukraine into a neutral state, which does not belong to any of the blocs, to the extent we are in the bloc logic here. Uh, Entering into international treaties, the new reality in as far as the self-determination of the people of Donbass and Novorossiya, and basically make sure that this is the starting point of the negotiation. It cannot be a question of, as we heard, reevaluate the prospect of having rump Ukraine join NATO 20 years down the road. It has
Right.
to be etched into the treaties. Now, how do you verify this? Well, there's a lot of precedent where we had treaties, which, as Reagan used to say, trust but verify. So, with satellite imagery, we can see, concentration of troops. We can start seeing, what some people are trying to do, attempting to do in order to circumvent some of the main clauses of treaties. But you got to have some kind of legal framework, to at least say, well, hey, you're getting out of your lane here.
Mhm.
So right now we have no legal framework whatsoever. We have a situation which, in thus far as what we hear from Washington, is an option to freeze the conflict and basically lead to what I call essentially a Minsk 3.
Syria.
And the Russians are not going to go for this. I mean, they're not fundamentally untrustworthy people in as far as what they hear from, their partners, quote unquote. But in the wake of what happened the last 30 years, it's understandable that they they would be guarded as to trusting the ink on the document and
I
what
guess
it
my
means.
issue is they saw the overthrow of the legally elected government in Ukraine, the Yanukovych government of 2014, as a legal thing. Meaning they took no issue with the fact that they overthrew a European government because they were the ones that were putting money into overthrowing it. And I guess my issue is any kind of legal thing depends upon the people who are making the choice about what's legal and what's not. For example, Gazprom. So Ukraine is trying to take Gazprom to court in Stockholm, Sweden. Everybody and their mama knows what that verdict is going to be, regardless of what they're bringing up as a case. They're going to go for Ukraine because that's the way Europe has gone. That is technically a legal process, and it's a legal process that's going to err on the side of Ukraine, regardless of what the case is. You can say, does Putin hate puppies? The man has a dog, and they would come back. Yes, Putin hates puppies, meaning it doesn't matter what it is. That is a legal framework. That is a legal framework that's taking place in Europe, and that is a legal framework that's coming back with nonsense as a verdict. That's my issue with the legal stuff. I don't believe in international law. I don't think it exists. And if Russia is looking for a legal solution to it, by my accounting of it, if I don't believe in international law, I don't know how a legal accounting of it is going to do anything. I guess my thought is if they see something where NATO's blowing it off, are they going to attack? Like, meaning, is it going to be that much on a walking a tightrope? For example, some of the deals that people have been thinking up have involved this idea of security guarantees from various partners in Europe that they would get involved if anything pops up in regards to conflict. Now, again, look at the way that they function now. Anything could happen that they would take. I mean, you mentioned it yourself: Ghost of Kiev, Snake Island, Russia blew up its own pipeline. Russia attacked its own base that was holding Ukrainian troops because they hated Ukrainian troops that much. This stuff is nonsense, and yet this is the stuff that they put out in the mainstream media and Western leaders run with. No, North Korean troops have been killed by the tens of thousands. I mean, this stuff is nonsense. They haven't shown that one North Korean troop. So I guess that's my concern with any kind of deal. Like, no, I don't want a situation where Russia takes all of Ukraine because the work involved, the deaths that are going to be involved, the level of destruction and everything else. By the same token, I don't see how a deal is feasible. Meaning, I don't know the thing that mends or makes this go away. It seems like if anything, Russia is stuck in a conflict that is going to be difficult to extricate itself from, even if it comes up with some kind of deal. Ultimately, there's no way to know that Europe is going to stick to the deal. Correct me if I'm wrong, though.
Well, I guess you raised the question of having a credible and worthy partner, someone who, basically will tell the Europeans to tone it down, or less, you're on your own. So that's the whole point about the Trump administration coming in on this particular file, at least.
Mhm.
Yeah. Whether or not Trump will be able to enjoin the European to assume full responsibility for their own actions, where Washington on its own has either the intent to reorient its foreign policy to a different theater, or to, as far as Trump is concerned, because that's after all the platform on which he was elected, to be
That's right.
able to focus on kickstarting U.S. economy and getting people out of the inflation dregs, which, notwithstanding the fact that they're cannibalizing Europe, they have still suffered immensely from all this money that's coming out and all this printing press going crazy. So Trump needs to have free hands to deliver. He has 2 years until the midterm election to come up with the goods.
Mhm.
So it is a priority for him, if he wants to preserve his majority in Congress, both houses of Congress, against the grain of precedent, midterm elections, which usually sees the incumbent party lose the House or one of the two houses, to make sure that it delivers, and that it delivers in a way that the American people can perceive it in their day-to-day lives. Short of that, it will be a failure. So the
Yeah.
only way for him to do this is to extricate himself out of the Ukraine situation, less he becomes himself no different than Joe Biden, which is the worst thing that could happen to Trump. So we'll see what happens. But the political imperative of the Trump administration, the incoming Trump administration, to deliver on the most pressing issue at home is most likely what will determine whether or not he is willing to
Determined.
then rein in the Europeans, or at least send them, kick them to the curve. Essentially,
Mhm.
you want to pay for this, then you're gonna have to jack up your NATO, the share of NATO expenditure out of your own budgets up to 5%, knowing full well that this is not going to be sustainable over the long run in Europe. So he
It'd
has
be
a lot of cards to play, but he has to really be subtle. Keep in mind that to dress up the what we know, negotiations are going to be between DC and Moscow, but for the narrative purpose, we need to dress up the process as being a Ukrainian-Russian process. Right now, we have an illegitimate president in the person of Zelensky. Zelensky is politically carbonized. I don't think he'll be able to present himself in front of Ukrainian voters. So we might see people like plucked out, like Arestovich, who is being now doing a lot of podcasts in the US,
yes,
who's
yes.
been saying all the right things since the start of the special military operation. He cut off his ties with Zelensky pretty early on in the game. And then we also have former supreme commander of the Ukrainian armed forces, Zaluzhny, who
Hmm.
is right now waiting in the wings as a Ukrainian ambassador in London.
In the UK.
So
Right.
that's right. So we can expect those two to pretty much battle to become the next president of Ukraine. But if you look at the time it takes logistically to prepare an election, to have a campaign so that most candidates may share with the public what they intend on doing. Most will say they want to bring the war to an end in an honorable fashion, most likely. We might not be looking at having a Ukrainian president, legally recognized, internationally recognized Ukrainian president, until late spring, early summer, which means that notwithstanding conversations that will be ongoing behind the scenes, negotiations per se won't begin until most likely next summer. That leaves
Mhm.
6 months for Trump to somehow, I would say, give, I would say, guarantees to the military-industrial complex that it will keep supplying, maybe not at the same level, but keep supplying the Ukrainian proxies with equipment and monies. Again, in what extent these monies will be determined, the amount of monies will be determined, that remains to be seen. But that should be enough of a leverage for him to tell them, look, I'm not just dropping the ball here. I'm
Yeah.
giving you what you need. And push comes to shove, the Europeans will pay for it. They will buy our own equipment anyway. I will force them to increase their budgets if they want NATO to survive. And through this ramping up in European military budgets, you'll be able to eat. That's basically what he's going to tell them, right?
Yeah.
Then they'll tell him, okay, fine. This arrangement of some sort will allow him to get his way, work his way through summertime, at which time will be time to sit down and come up with a serious framework. We know that I'm not sure he understands, Trump himself, uh, what Russia intends on accomplishing and gaining. So that will be Kellogg's job to go to Moscow and get probe the Russian leadership
Mhm.
and go back and brief Trump on what we're talking about here. Because I
Arno,
think
man.
yes.
No, no. Please finish. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so that will be on the US side of things. On the Russian side of things, they have 6 months to make more gains, essentially, and consolidate and extend their military gains, so that when the time for negotiation comes, they have a lot of cards to play. They can withdraw from some areas, or basically yeah, withdraw from some areas. I don't think, like you said, you're right. they don't want to take all of Ukraine. That's not part of the plan, but they want to go as far as possible westward to neutralize the range of the long range missiles. So
Mhm.
that would most likely at least include the Dnieper and maybe beyond, bearing on their estimation of what kind of ballistic capabilities the West is able to use in the future.
Arnaud,
Once
man,
there's some kind of consensus on this kind of redrawing of Ukraine, then they'll be able to talk.
Arnaud, man, thank you for this. I really appreciate this conversation. I appreciate your insight on this. I really do, and I think my audience did also. Arnaud Develay, he's an international lawyer specializing in international criminal law and participating in the defense of former President Saddam Hussein with former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark. In the wake of the Caesar Act, he documented the illegal sanction regime imposed on Syria while living in Damascus. He is author of Foreign Entanglements, Biden, Ukraine, and the Fracturing of American Political Consensus. Thank you for this, man. And Happy New Year, by the way.
Happy New Year to you and to all the viewers.
Ah, thank you,
See
man.
you next year.
See you next year. Have a good one.